a major player in it? The Romans. So if you just look at the New Testament, the Romans are kind of there, and you have Pontius Pilate is there. But they had a major impact on Christianity right from the very beginning. So that's what we're going to do. Okay. So quick review. Alexander the Great died, and his generals left the crumbling empire. The Ptolemies and the Seleucids basically split up Egypt and the Syrian region. The Seleucids region went all the way to India in Hindu Kush. Hellenism keeps raising its head throughout all of this narrative, and Alexander was the progenitor of that. He wanted to have everybody to be Greek, common language, common money, common values, and of course, that became a major stumbling block for the Pharisees, so we know that. And the Sadducees, they liked it. It was the group that eventually became the Sadducees. They were the Hellenists, and they liked that kind of lifestyle that was introduced by Alexander. Then we get over to Antiochus IV. We've heard about him. Bill's talked about him. I've talked about him before. And he is the guy who really imposed Hellenization on the Jews, defiled the temple, and basically, because of him, it led to the Maccabean revolt. And the Maccabees, over a period of time, eventually allow Judea to gain its independence from the Seleucids. And here's Rome again. Rome supported the Maccabees, and there was a series of treaties between the Maccabees and Rome, and Rome basically gave their support. Simon Maccabee was the last Maccabee, and he was murdered along with all of his family except for one son, John Hyrcanus. And so we pick up the story here, but we're going to start in 6 BC. Okay, what we're going to do is we'll start there, we're going to go back in time, and then we're going to come forward in time. Okay, so this is the situation in 6 BC. The Romans dominate the Mediterranean region. They have a military governor. Caesar Augustus is the emperor, okay, in Rome. There's civil war between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but that was quelled by the Romans. So it's stopped. The Hasmonean kingdom, which was dominant in the Judean area, it's gone. Herod the Great is now the king. And so we're going to talk about that, how he got there. The Pharisees and the Sadducees are the dominant religions. The Essenes have basically departed the scene. They're disgusted with both groups. The Zealots periodically are terrorizing everybody. And we're going to talk a lot about the Zealots next week. But right here, a wonderful thing happens. In 6 BC in Bethlehem. And what happens? Jesus Christ is born. And how are the Romans connected to this? We're going to talk about that. Micah 5:2 foretells 700 years prior to that event that is going to happen in Bethlehem. Calls it out. Okay? We're going to talk about that. So now all of the players are there. We've got the Romans, Pharisees, Sadducees. And now, we're going to be talking about that history of all of the things that happened that lead up to the crucifixion of Christ. And remember the thread, because it's all connected together. Okay. So, we're going to jump back to 134 BC. John Hyrcanus is the surviving Maccabee. He was the last of the Maccabees. And he was a high priest, and he was a Pharisee. Okay? So he was the first of the Pharisees. Okay, there were a series of basically wars, minor wars with the Seleucids. This guy right here, Antiochus Sedetes, that's this guy here. And basically some of the people in Jerusalem were taken as hostages, and there was a deal struck, and 500 talents of gold and silver was paid to get them back. Where did he get the money? From King David's tomb. Okay, so they robbed about 3,000 talents of gold and silver. They paid out 500, kept the rest. Okay, of course they did, right? So here enter the Parthians, right? We talked about them last week. They kill Sedetes. And basically then there was a peace across the land for quite a while, and it was, of course, it was temporary. Hyrcanus, he expanded the Jewish territory. Interestingly, he destroyed the Samaria and the temple on Mount Gerizim, and with the goal of having one temple, and everyone who was going to sacrifice would have to come to Jerusalem. That's why the temples were set up in Samaria, up in that region of Israel, because Jeroboam, if you recall, didn't want the Jews living up there having to go to Jerusalem, because they would maybe stay in Jerusalem, or they would be influenced by the temple. So he set up two temples, one in Bethel and one in Dan. And so they didn't have to go down. Of course, they had a golden calf that they were sacrificing to. So that was not okay. Now, they conquered the Idumeans. Remember from the map last week, there's Judah, and then the Idumeans had migrated over into southern Judah. And Hyrcanus conquered the Idumeans. What does he do? He did exactly the same thing that the Seleucids did. The Seleucids were forcing the united culture. Hyrcanus was forcing a united religion. And so they forced the Idumeans into Judaism, and basically with the associated forced circumcision of the men. And so, but the Idumeans were not Jews. Okay, so this is important going forward. Just keep that thought. Okay. He sent envoys to Rome to cover the expansion. Rome agreed. So when the Romans start moving eastward, Judea is sitting there, and they kind of left them alone. Hyrcanus had his falling out with the rest of his Pharisee buddies. There was one of them, this guy Eleazar, and he accused Hyrcanus of not being a Jew. He said that he was actually a Seleucid, where his mother had been raped by basically the Seleucids, and that he was the issue of a Seleucid. Okay? Hyrcanus got irritated, of course, because his mother had been murdered, right? And so he denied it, and so he switched parties. He became a Sadducee. All right, so he's no longer a Pharisee, he's a Sadducee. So when the leader switches, that means everybody who's in charge of stuff is out if they're a Pharisee, Sadducees are in. So they control basically everything. And the Sadducees had been out of power for quite a while, and so now they're in power. All right, so to kind of give you a sense of the growth of the Hasmonean kingdom, there, down here, right down in this region, we have Jerusalem. The Idumeans were down in this region. Eventually, Israel grows to about this area. Their Hasmonean kingdom grows here. Hyrcanus added this green part here, okay? And it's kind of give you a sense. Here's the Dead Sea. There's the Dead Sea. This is modern Israel. Kind of give you a sense. So it's interesting that part of this actually falls over into Jordan. So anyway, just an aside there. Okay. Hyrcanus eventually dies, has a son Judah Aristobulus won, okay? And basically, Hyrcanus wanted the son and mom to rule the kingdom. But Aristobulus had different ideas. He puts mom in prison, starves her to death, okay? Nice guy, right? Okay, and then he puts his 3 of his 4 brothers in prison. And basically, this is a narrative here. Basically, he kills his other brother who he left out by some subterfuge, and he gets executed. Okay. He extended the boundaries of the Jewish territories. Fortunately, he was only on the throne for a year, and then he died. Okay, so anyway, he was not a good person. So next up is the brother Alexander Jannaeus, who was one of the 3 in prison. He survived, and he takes over. He was a Sadducee, right? And basically, he would cause all kinds of political problems, and they had a few minor wars with the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, and it was going back and forth. Eventually, the Ptolemies withdraw back into Egypt, and basically the Seleucids end up in control of the region. And so the kingdom was expanded more. So that map that I showed, it was under Jannaeus. That's the extent. All of the color there was as large as the kingdom became. Now, the Jews, the regular folks, they hated him. And so on one of the Feast of the Tabernacles, they throw this fruit at him. They're like lemons, I guess. They're called citrons, okay? He proceeds to kill 6,000 of them because of that. He just murdered them, right? And he got into another dust-up with the Arabs, and he escapes to Jerusalem, and over the next 6 years, so he was in power there for about 27 years. So over the next 6 years, he killed about 50,000 Jews, and for various reasons. So what happens? He's a Sadducee now. The Pharisees hate him, and so they decide that they are going to go outside of Judea to get help to overthrow him. And where do they go? They go to the Seleucids to help them. And this king, Demetrius III, said, of course, I'll help you. And he comes down with 40,000 footmen, 3,000 horsemen. And Jannaeus' army was 20,000 Jews and around 6,000 mercenaries. Okay. Now, most of the Jews there that were fighting with him were Sadducees. So now we have a big civil war that has kicked off against the Pharisees and the Sadducees. If you don't look at this history, you never know this when you go into the New Testament. This is, yes, sir. Absolutely. There are political parties. Yep. Okay, so anyway, Jannaeus gets overrun, he's routed, and he's on the run. But 6,000 of the Jews that were fighting for the Seleucids abandon him, and they come back over to the Sadducees. Okay, so they just switch sides. Demetrius gets a little concerned. They withdraw back into Syria, into that region, and the Pharisees are left holding the bag. Okay, so their support just left. And what happens? Jannaeus starts killing them. So, and basically this civil war came in waves, and it lasted the entire time that Jannaeus was in power. So over 27 years, then there was a series of these battles that went on between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, and this was the terrible part. So when they identified Pharisees, then they would kill them, but also they would kill the family by cutting throats of wives and children. So they would wipe out entire families. Jannaeus also crucified 800 Pharisees for going outside to Demetrius III. So this was a brutal guy. And also, there's huge animosity between the Sadducees and Pharisees continued on. This is the thing that I don't get, and is why the Jews liked Jannaeus after he had some victories, and I guess would be against the Seleucids again. And basically, they looked on him favorably, even though he had killed so many of them. So, but when he died, he told his wife, Salome Alexandra, to get the Pharisees to help her. Because it was going to go badly if the Sadducees stayed in power. Because he was a Sadducee, and it was kind of pandemonium there. Yeah. Yes, sir. You know what? It's an interesting question. I haven't seen any place where you could actually tell the difference between the groups, other than if they line up and you start running at each other, and certainly you can see the guys in the front who would be the, yeah. But it's a good question. Good question. So there's a question about crucifixion. We can find that out, I think. Anyway, Salome Alexandra gets help from the Pharisees. And so she was actually a pretty good leader. And interestingly, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, she's actually mentioned in there along with 18 other people. So she must have really made an impression. She controlled the region with mercenaries, basically terrorizing the locals around the region there. And so she had to deal with both the Pharisees and Sadducees. So she gave a lot of power to the Pharisees. Okay, Pharisees in, Sadducees out. So now the Pharisees control basically the country. Okay? Okay, so now it gets worse. She had two sons. One was Hyrcanus II, and she appointed him to be high priest. He is a Pharisee. All right? And Hyrcanus II did not want to have anything to do with the government or the high priesthood. He just wanted to be a regular guy living around. But he was kind of forced into that by mom, okay? And he was not a very good Pharisee, okay? He was just a regular guy, okay? His brother, Aristobulus II, was a player. He was a Sadducee. He was an up-and-comer, and he was going to do everything that he could to get to the top of the heap. And so you can see where this is headed, right? I mean, it's like bad news happening here. So Alexandra gets sick, and Aristobulus was concerned about the Pharisees taking over and kicking the Sadducees completely out of the place. And so what does he do? He raises an army, and he takes control of parts of the region around Judea. Alexandra dies, and now Hyrcanus II is now in charge of everything. He is now the king. He's also the high priest, because that was the outcome of the Maccabees, where the priest and the king became the single point there. Okay, so, and also, now his brother is outside the gates trying to take over things. So now the civil war is going to continue. The fight ensues, and Hyrcanus II flees to the temple. Now, this is the temple. This is not the one when Jesus, at that time, during Jesus' time. this is the one that Zerubbabel built. And so in these temples, if you look at the layout of these things, we're going to do that next week, but these are like basically fortresses in there. So if you flee into the temple, it's going to be real difficult to get dug out of there. Okay. So anyway, they strike an agreement, Hyrcanus and his brother Aristobulus. And basically, Hyrcanus agrees to retire to the private life because he didn't want to be in politics anyway or in the high priesthood. So, and also, this is important. Generally, when power changed there, somebody died. But in this case, they had a peaceful transition. There was a truce that was made, and basically, Hyrcanus walks away from it. But he had a friend, okay? And the friend was the son of this general, this Idumean general. And who was he? He was Antipater I, right? So if you guys did your homework, you'd know who that guy was. So Antipater I, his son was Antipater II. And they were good buddies, he and Hyrcanus. And what does he convince him to do? Raise an army and let's go take care of business and put Hyrcanus back into the priesthood. So Hyrcanus probably wasn't very enthusiastic about it, but his friend convinced him. Who was Antipater II? He was Herod the Great's father. Okay, so we're kind of, this is that thread, okay, that we're talking about. Now, Sadducees and fighting Pharisees, and it's around 67 BC, and that civil war is continuing. All right. Aristobulus II. So, the Romans now have been out conquering, and they've been moving east along the Mediterranean, right? And in 63 BC, this man right here, Marcus Aemilius Scaurus, shows up there. Has nothing to do with the civil war going on. Remember, there was a treaty that was signed so that Rome recognized Judea as an independent nation. And so with all of the treaties, if they were having a civil war, that was their problem, not Rome's problem. Okay, so just this note, right? Pompey, who is Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, this guy Scaurus worked for Pompey, and Pompey was the great general that did all of the conquering. Okay, along the Mediterranean. Okay, so eventually Pompey gets murdered by Cleopatra VII, Philopator, and her husband brother. I mean, this is insane, but anyway, it's the Cleo we know. There were a whole bunch of them, but she was the pharaoh of Egypt down in Alexandria. Okay, now, so eventually Pompey is murdered down there, and Pompey was Julius Caesar's son-in-law. Okay, so there were these family ties there also. Okay, so Aristobulus has backed into the temple, and he is surrounded by Arabs from Hyrcanus II and Antipater. Okay, and so they're stuck in there now. Both groups, Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, send envoys to Scaurus, and for a bribe, and they mentioned a bribe of 400 talents, and for help, right? So Aristobulus says, Scaurus says, I like Aristobulus better because he's more likely to be able to come up with the money than Hyrcanus. And so he takes the offer from Aristobulus and he orders the Arabs to leave Jerusalem, and basically then Hyrcanus is left without his support. Okay, Aristobulus regroups. They attack Hyrcanus, killing another 6,000 of his troops. So this is a continuation of that civil war. Then the ambassadors are sent to Pompey. Antipater II for Hyrcanus, Nicodemus for Aristobulus, and there was a third contingent who just wanted the whole Hasmonean kingdom to end. And so there was probably regular folks who were sending out there saying, you got to stop this madness because you have this civil war that's been going on for such a long time. Anyway, they go out to Pompey. Okay, Pompey was on his way to take care of the Nabatean Arabs. Okay, the Nabatean Arabs were the guys who had murdered one of the Maccabees, and there was a blood feud between them and the Maccabees. So, but he was going down there, and he was bypassing Judea. Okay, he said, when I get done with these guys, we'll come back, we'll get it sorted out. In the meantime, shut up, one thing, right, and stop fighting. That was his conditions. Okay, Aristobulus, he's a player, okay, and he goes, I don't think so. So he advances his army into Judea, and what happens? Pompey stops his campaign against the Arabs and swings back the whole army and comes back to Jerusalem, okay? And so there were a series of meetings, and Aristobulus offered up Jerusalem and money to stop the Romans from attacking. And basically, his soldiers attacked the Romans. Okay, so, and that's just insane. But anyway, they did, and so Aristobulus end up being taken captive, and Jerusalem is besieged by the Romans. All right. So Hyrcanus sided with the Romans and allowed them to inside, and they took the king's palace there. And the Sadducees, followers of Aristobulus, are holed up in the temple. And basically, they make it very difficult for the Romans to get into them. What happens? The Romans are Romans. They build stuff, right? And what they do? They filled that. There was a big, basically, it's a ditch 250 feet wide so they can breach the temple. And how'd they do that? They did it with battering rams and those sorts of things. 12,000 Jews died because of that. And some by the Romans, some by suicide, jumping off the city walls. Some of them were setting themselves on fire. I mean, it's crazy. But it's 63 BC. Okay. Pompey entered the Holy of Holies in the temple once they had cleaned out the Sadducees. Interestingly, they didn't take any of the treasure, and also he ordered that the temple be cleaned up, and he put Hyrcanus II as the high priest. So Pharisees are back in power again, all right? And and he's a puppet high priest under the Roman rule. So, but he had full religious authority. Aristobulus, 2 daughters and a son, they are hauled off to Rome. Okay. You begin to ask yourself the question, or I did anyway, is why didn't the Romans just kill them to end the madness? There's the thread. Always think of that thread through there because there's a reason that they're there. So Alexander II, one of the sons, manages to escape, and he is a real pain in the neck for Rome and Hyrcanus. In 48 BC or thereabouts, Julius Caesar made Hyrcanus II the ethnarch of Rome. So basically, he was like an authority, but he had to report directly to Antipater II, who is his buddy and he's an Idumean, right? Okay, he is the Roman procurator. Okay, so we're going to hold on Hyrcanus right there. We'll get back to him in a minute. All right. And basically, Antipater II is the procurator. Okay. Meanwhile, Alexander II, the son of Aristobulus, he escapes from the Romans, raises an army to fight the Romans, but he eventually surrendered to the Romans. He lost, right? Aristobulus II, this is the brother now of Hyrcanus, and another son, Antigonus, they escape and they return to Judea, rebuild an army, but the Romans capture him again, back to Rome. Okay. The Roman Senate then, this is like a bad soap opera. All right. The Roman Senate then frees all of the children of Aristobulus because the Roman general Gabinius made a promise to their mother that he would release all of the children. So they do. They turn them loose, okay? And it's like you've got these people who are starting these wars and fighting with the Romans, and they just turned them loose again, right? All right, so Alexander II, now free, he's continuing trying to take power. Okay, Antipater II was asked by General Gabinius to talk some sense into him, tried, no joy, basically, right? So there was another engagement at Mount Tabor between Gabinius and Alexander. Again, he's defeated, and 10,000 men got killed, but not him. All right? Okay, so in 49 BC, there's a civil war breaks out in Rome. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, right? So you've heard when you cross the Rubicon, you can't go back. The Romans, there was a law that said that they had to keep their armies out across the river in the Rubicon River, that they could never do that coming into Rome. Okay, he broke the rule, and he comes into Rome with them, with the army. Pompey, okay, his son-in-law, flees, and the Senate fled Rome. Pompey went south in Italy and then crossed over into Greece. Okay, then Caesar decides to release Aristobulus II, the brother of Hyrcanus, and provide him with 2 legions, 12,000 men, to go back down to Judea and basically clean things out. Remember, Pompey had been in control of that region, so a lot of his soldiers were still down there. So this was the civil war between the Romans themselves, and also there was an ongoing civil war between the Jews. So we had 2 civil wars, and basically the Pharisees and the Sadducees are like right in the middle of this, okay? Now, Pompey discovers that Caesar has let Aristobulus II. He arranges to have him poisoned. And then, finally, they hunted down Alexander and killed him also. Okay, so those are 2 players out. The brother is now dead, and nephews are now dead except for one. And that's Antigonus. So he tried to get control of Judea, and by raising armies, failed. And so this is the crazy thing. He goes back to Rome and complains to Caesar that Antipater II had poisoned his father and killed his brother, and that Hyrcanus II and Antipater II ruled by violence. And it's like, why didn't Caesar just take care of him right then? But he didn't. And so he requested Caesar appoint him as the ruler of Judea. Didn't happen. Antipater is the proconsul. Hyrcanus is the high priest. And that's the way it ended up. So, 44 BC, Julius Caesar is assassinated. And after the assassination, Antigonus II continues to raise the army to try to take power. But Antipater too, okay, the friend of Hyrcanus, right, and Herod's dad, right, he has died in Judea, and he had 4 sons. Herod was one of them, and basically Herod now is in control of everything. So Antipater was the proconsul, but Herod now finds himself in charge of everything. He's not the king, but he is in charge. And Antigonus engages the Parthians. So the Parthians had thrown out the Seleucids, and they're going at it a bit with the Romans. Okay, and basically he strikes a deal to kill Herod, depose Hyrcanus too, and for 1,000 talents and 500 Jewish women. So there's a meeting that's arranged between Herod, his brother Faisal, and Hyrcanus with the Parthians to work out a truce. Okay, but the ulterior motive was to kill Faisal and Herod and establish Antigonus too as the priest king. So Faisal finds this out, and basically about the deception, and he could have left, but he wouldn't leave Hyrcanus. And so he was an honorable man, and he just stayed there with Hyrcanus. Herod finds out about the deception, and he flees Jerusalem with his whole entourage. There's 9,000 people, and they go back to Idumea, right, which is in the south. And the Parthians must have been asleep. I mean, it's 9,000 people that you got to move, right? So anyway, the Parthians have overrun Judea, and they had plundered Jerusalem. Antigonus too is made the high priest. Hyrcanus and Faisal are captured and in Jerusalem. Now, Antigonus had the Parthians cut Hyrcanus' ears off. And the reason is because he could never be a high priest again because he was blemished. So the high priest couldn't have any kind of blemishes. And Faisal eventually kills himself. So Hyrcanus is, so by the law, he cannot ever be a high priest, right? And that was the competition to be the priest king just went away as far as Antigonus was concerned. All right. Meanwhile, Herod tries to get help from the Arabs. Okay, and that didn't happen. He heads into Egypt. Cleopatra VII, the Cleo we know, all right, she wanted him to stay. By the way, she had tried to work her wiles on Mark Antony to kill Herod so she could take over Judea. And Mark Antony wasn't having any of it. So there's like lots going on there. Anyway, Herod got an audience with Mark Antony and the Roman Senate. And he relates a story about what happened. So he is actually was, until he left, control of Judea, right? So after his oration, they immediately made him king of the Jews. So it was the Romans that actually made Herod the king of the Jews. And he is not a Jew. He's an Idumean, okay? And basically they denounced Antigonus too as an enemy state, and Herod was actually surprised to become king, okay? He went there for help, and he comes back as a king. So anyway, the Roman army in Syria is dispatched to Judea, and Herod made his way back to Syria, and they besieged Masada, where Herod's family, so some of them were still holed up there. And then they headed to Jerusalem, where there was an offer of amnesty for everyone. Antigonus too said, no way, I will not allow a Idumean, a half Jew, take my place as king. Okay, so anyway, Herod had cleaned out all of the supporters for Antigonus too. So there was no one around there to help him. And basically, some of it was pretty brutal. There's a description of it. Anyway, we'll just move on because I'm running out of time. It is. We're getting to that. Yep. Herod's army was 6,000 men, so he's on his way, plus 800 Jews. They hook up with Mark Antony. He provides another 2 legions. That's another 12,000 men. But by the time he gets to Jerusalem, he has 11 legions. Yes, sir. He was. And he was one of the great generals. Yeah. Okay. And because of Herod having this interaction with Mark Antony, they become friends, pretty close friends. Okay. So they're headed back to Rome and to take over. Note that Mariamna I, who is his soon-to-be wife, he was going to attack her hometown. So anyway, that's my note. Did not bode well for their relationship. Anyway, the Jerusalem fell to the Romans, so they kicked the Parthians out. Everyone, and basically they killed a lot of people. Everyone except Antigonus too, right? So the Romans plundered it so badly that Herod complained to the Syrian governor that if you guys keep plundering this place, I'm not going to have anything to rule. And so they basically at that point they stopped. And then Herod arranged with Mark Antony to kill Antigonus too, who was on his way to Rome as a prisoner. And they poisoned him for a bribe, always for a bribe, right? So that was the end of the Hasmonean rule. And there were other Hasmoneans, but Rome is now in power in that region. Herod is now he is now the king, and we still have the Pharisees and the Sadducees that are going at it a bit. Okay, it's 37 BC. All right, absolutely. There's back to John Hyrcanus. So anyway, he gets released eventually, and he settles in Babylon, of all places. And the Jews there honor him as the high priest. So they either couldn't read the rules or they didn't care about the rules. Anyway, he ends up as the high priest. But eventually, Herod entices him back to Jerusalem, right? And he was reluctant, and then he goes back to Jerusalem. And then after Julius Caesar's assassination, there's a civil war breaks out between Mark Antony and Octavian. Okay, and Mark Antony comes up on the short end of the stick. He gets killed. Cleopatra VII, the Cleo we know, she's dead, and Octavian becomes the emperor, and he is the first emperor in Rome. Okay. Now, Herod has a problem now because he was good buddies with Mark Antony. And so he heads off to Rome and boasts about his loyalty to Mark Antony. And so Caesar, Augustus says, well, okay, you're okay because if you were loyal to Mark Antony, you'll be loyal to us. So Herod, in the end, ended up basically single-handedly wiping out the last of the Hasmonean Empire, or kingdom. And there was drownings, accidental drownings. He killed his wife, Mariamna I, because he jealous that she had been sleeping around with his uncle or something like that. Anyway, Alexandra, the mother-in-law, she tried to kill him a whole bunch of times, and finally, he had enough, and he kills her. Anyway, so basically, anybody who had a potential to ever become a king there was gone. And he stayed in power for 40 years. And he had 10 wives, and Miriam, one, was the most important to him. The Essenes were exempt from an oath of allegiance because one of them, this Menahem, who was an Essene, predicted that Herod would become king. Back to the Sadducees and Pharisees. Herod reintroduced a lot of the Hellenized things back into Judea that the Pharisees hated. So here we are, the Orthodox Jews, the Hellenized Jews, they start going at it again. And the only reason they didn't kill each other was the Romans were there to kind of keep a lid on things. So there were 10 conspiracies against him. And now the temple, when the New Testament opens, the temple that's there is the one that Herod built. Okay? And so we're going to talk about the next time the temples and the work that Herod did on the temples. Okay? So there were lots of people die. Herod dies in 4 BC. All right. Here we go. Now, here's the prophecy. You, Bethlehem, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet you shall come forth to me, the one to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from old, from everlasting. So that was a prophecy from 700 plus years before Christ was born. All right. So, both Herod and Caesar Augustus had their parts to play in this. And that was still part of the thread. Rome's firmly in control. This continues on. This Roman thing continues on for 1,000 years after this. And how important they were. Augustus is the first emperor. They have a military governor. The Sadducees are going at it because of Herod reintroduced a lot of the things that the Pharisees detested, and the Sadducees didn't really care. And if you go into Luke, he says, in those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken, okay? So Caesar is in place now. Augustus Caesar is now in place to make that decree. And what happens? Caesar Augustus likes censuses. And so there was a census that was taken. He did several of them. Anyway, he ordered at least 3 during his reign, and 1 being in 8 BC. All right. So, what do you have to do? You have to go home and to your hometown to register. So, off they go to Bethlehem. Who? Joseph and a very pregnant Mary, right? Off they go to register. So it is unknown how long they were actually there in Bethlehem. But the census was ordered in 8 BC. Christ was born in 6 BC, 2 years later. Now, and also there was a purification that had to be done. Mary needed to do that. So odds are she went to Jerusalem to the temple for that purification and then returned to Bethlehem. But there's a dream. Leave Bethlehem. And this was the question, Mike, you had. Herod is still around. This is around 6 BC, so he doesn't die till 4. And so there's a dream, and off they go to Egypt to escape this murder that Herod is doing. And then there's another part of a prophecy, out of Egypt I will call my son. So when Herod dies, there's another dream, come home. Okay, and Herod's death was the reason to come back. Okay. So Jesus grows up, becomes a rabbi, and traveling all around. He had his followers, but basically, and Bill's mentioned this before, as far as the crowds were concerned, he was a rock star. And the reason is he would preach, and he was marvelous. And also, he fed the masses. And so, but this is where he spent a lot of time explaining the parables to the disciples. Okay? And he called out the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Matthew 23, the scribes and the Pharisees. We read that last week. And so he embarrassed the Pharisees. And basically, they had a lack of knowledge of the Testament, the Old Testament, and their rituals, their insincerity, and the way they lived. And basically, it was like they wore their religion outside so everybody can see how pious they were. And God wants us to tend our hearts on the inside, not on the outside. So he also had close encounters with the Sadducees. Remember, a lot of their income came from ripping the Jews off when they went into the temple. So they were wealthy. And so basically, he calls them out as a den of thieves. So he was a threat to the income of the Sadducees, and also he was a threat to the Pharisees for just the hearts and minds of the regular Jews, because they were going to lose control of them. So Jesus had to die. So now what we have is we have these two enemies who come together, and they collude with the Romans, basically. And the Caiaphas, the Sadducee, the issue is not whether Jesus should die. They'd already made up their minds. He's got to die. It's still a question of when. So, and that's why it wasn't done on the Passover, day of the Passover. So Caiaphas was responsible to the Romans. He was the high priest. And to keep the peace, and so there might have been a riot, okay? So this is a little bit about Pontius Pilate. Basically, he was responsible for keeping the order. And so eventually, these sworn enemies, they come together and to plot to kill Jesus. And basically, there's a prophecy he would be killed by Gentiles. That's one bill that I looked, and I've seen several places that talks about that psalm. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. That he would be killed by Gentiles. No. Okay, so we can talk about that one because yeah, okay. And we know basically the rest of the narrative about the crucifixion. So, the sacrifice. And if you go back to John 3:16, God so loved the world that he gave his only son. And God gave his son to do what? To die, right? And so to be sacrificed, paying for the world's sins, and the end result of a sacrifice is death. And somebody has to be the executioner. So, I've often wondered why didn't the Jews just go ahead and kill Jesus when Caiaphas and company? And he had to die in a particular way, right? And these are all of the prophecies that talk about that. No bones would be broken. This is the one that I have a question about. And I've seen this in several places that it's actually talking about Gentiles. Yeah. So the dogs surround me. In Isaiah says, "He pierced for our transgressions, silent before the accusers, hung on wood." The cross was wood. Intense thirst. And then in here, my God, why have you forsaken me? So all of those things are foretold in the Old Testament. And so, finally, Rome. Rome was God's instrument, and it continued to be God's instrument. Someone had to be the executioner, and God chose the Romans to do that. Okay, and so this is a recap of the prophecies, and it wasn't something that just happened. It was prophesied that Rome would come to power. That's in Daniel, and God continued to use the Romans to help spread His word throughout the Roman Empire and the world. So next time we'll be talking about the destruction of the temple and how God used the Romans to be part of that. So again, back to that thread. There's this thread that goes through all of that history, going all the way back to the Maccabees, and you can see it. There's a connection. Every one of those events, if they didn't happen in a particular way, then you wouldn't end up at the end down there with the Romans crucifying Christ. That the enemies coming together would basically collude to put him on the cross. And so that is the conclusion of the road to the cross. So anyway, if you have questions, I've asked myself that. The thing that really floored me was the Jews just didn't kill him. And it is because of all of the prophecies